Hey, what's up? Andrew Kramer here, videocopilot.net. Welcome back to another very exciting tutorial. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Element 3D version 2.2. We've got a ton of new features, so let's dive right in. Now, please excuse the raspy voice. I've been taking this movie trailer voiceover class, and if I have to say, in a world, one more time, I just may become one man with nothing to lose. Or I'm just getting over a cold. So one of those things is true. All right, so let's take a look at the first new feature. It's called Group Symmetry. Now, the way it works is that if we go inside of our scene setup, and inside you'll see I have this component that looks like a futuristic train track. Now, the way it works is that if I click on my group folder, there's a new option called Group Symmetry. And what I can do is turn off the group symmetry for Y and Z, and this is actually what our object looks like. So what I'm doing is taking all of the objects that are inside of the group, and I'm turning on the symmetry mode for the Y-axis and for the Z-axis. So that's how you can basically create repeated objects using the symmetry mode. And I can move any of the objects that are inside around, and all of the other objects will stay connected. And because it's an instance, I can take a material, say a gold material, and I can throw it onto one of the components, and it'll update for all of the components that are referenced by that same instance. So it's a nice way also to be able to keep track of things that are supposed to be the same on both the left and the right. Now, here's a more simple example. If I just come over here to the motion design stuff, and I can just open up one of these components, and I can take the group folder, turn on the Y-axis group symmetry. Now, then I need to select the objects that are inside and move them off axis. So maybe I'll do Z and X. So let's move it over in the Z and slide it over on the X. So now I've made 8 copies, right? But I can take that group folder, throw it into another group folder, turn on the group symmetry mode, and then just remember to select the objects inside of the group and move those over. So now I've created all of these different copies, all from a single instance, and now I can just change one color and it'll update for all of the copies. So it's a really cool feature and really easy, really fun to work with. So let me show you another example. It's these sort of futuristic doors. And I'm using the group symmetry mode to open the doors up and animate them inside of After Effects. So I'll go into the scene setup, and I'm using some matte shadows to sort of reveal the edges into the composite, but here's a version without a matte shadow. And there's basically 3 components. You've got the base, which is what's underneath the doors. We've got the second door, and then we've got the top door. The way it works is I've turned on the group symmetry mode for the top door on the X-axis. So then if I select the top door and move it on the X-axis, you'll see that it opens up and it mirrors as it opens up. Now, in order to animate this in After Effects, I'm selecting the top door, not the layer with the symmetry, but just the door element by itself, and going into the auxiliary animation and setting it to channel 1. And then I did the same thing for the second door, and I set it to auxiliary channel 2. So what that allows you to do is then take the auxiliary channel animation and basically open and close the doors. And so I just have a few keyframes here to animate the doors opening and closing. So think about symmetry as a way to create repeated animations on both sides of something, and even doing really complicated fun animations. I mean, I don't want to design on the fly here, but I'll bet you if I just take this top door element and duplicate it and then rotate it like that, I bet you it would kind of create sort of a square door opening up. So there's a few issues there, but I think the idea is there. And that's all being animated with a single keyframe for that particular door. So if I turned all these keyframes off, that one main door would open up with just 2 keyframes. All right, so that is the group symmetry feature. All right, so the next feature we've added is called group dynamic reflections. So what exactly is a group dynamic reflection? Well, let's take a look. So we'll jump inside of the scene setup, and here is what it looks like when it's on. So let me just show you a simple scene and talk about the way it works in version 2. So in version 2, I could add a dynamic reflection to an individual object. So I could take our text here, come over here to the dynamic reflection mode, turn it on to, say, spherical, and it would create sort of a fake reflection that makes it look a little bit more integrated. So you can see it kind of reflects a little bit of the red ground and just overall looks more real. The only problem is that the dynamic reflection is for an individual object only. So if I wanted to come over here to the motion design and add some bolts, I'd have to turn on the dynamic reflection for every single bolt or every single object that I added to this one scene if I wanted to reflect with the red. Now, the problem with that is that will start to slow things down. So I could turn this to spherical, and every copy you make is another spherical map that has to be generated. So the solution that we've come up with is to allow group folders to have their own dynamic reflection mode. So in this case, I've got a bunch of parts, components, all this stuff, and I'm only using one spherical map to create the reflection. So I'll turn it off here to set it to default, and you can see that there's no reflection, and all of these objects are inside of this one group folder. So I'll turn the reflect mode on for spherical, and now I've created a little bit of reflection for every single one of these objects that's inside of this group folder. So you can see a little bit of red on the bolts, you can see red on all the text, all the layers, and this is a really good solution because it doesn't require a dynamic reflection map for every single little component. So this way you're able to create really complex looking scenes and use as few reflection maps as necessary. Now, it goes also for the ground reflection. So typically, in the old version, you could do a mirror reflection. You'd come over here and you'd turn it on to mirror surface, and it would reflect, and that's great. But if I were to add some components onto my scene, those wouldn't reflect properly, and then I'd have to turn on the mirror mode and adjust the offset and all that kind of stuff. But in version 2.2, what you can do is you can set the reflect mode for an entire group. So I can set this to mirror surface. Then I can come over here, add some components. Now keep in mind that the mirror reflection mode still works specifically for a flat surface. So we do want to make sure that this is lowered down so it's pretty flat. That's pretty good. But check it out. I'm reflecting very nicely. I can make a copy of this, maybe add some other components, some other little details. Because futuristic floors have to have details. All right, so that is the group reflections. The next feature we have is called matte reflection. So in the previous version, we have a feature called matte shadow. And what it allows you to do is cast a shadow or ambient occlusion onto your background plate or your live action footage. So in this case, here's what it looks like. But since we've added a new feature called dynamic reflection, we thought it would be cool to be able to create a reflection that also composites on your live action footage. So we've added a matte reflection option. So it looks something like this. So now you can create reflections and shadows, and they're all going to composite in the correct order and look really cool. Let me show you how it works. All right, so it's pretty simple. Just create a little color here so we can see it. There we go. All you have to do is create a plane with a mirror surface. So you need to make sure that it is reflecting. And then we go down to the material for the plane. And we have a whole bunch of new options, and we'll talk about them in just a second. But you'll see here there's an option called matte reflection. So if you turn it off, well, turn off matte shadow also. So here's what the material looks like normally. It's just sort of a metallic reflective material. So we turn on matte shadow, and that gets rid of it, except now we can see a little bit of the shadow underneath. And then we're going to turn on matte reflection. So it's as simple as that. You just turn on matte reflection and matte shadow, and both of those things will be composited, and you can do a lot of cool stuff with that. You can also now output just the dynamic reflection, which is good if you want to add some different effects to just that layer and composite it later. So that's cool. We used that on a recent project, in fact. The other thing we've added is a mirror surface quality, and that's just going to be in very specific cases with the physically based shaders. If you don't feel like you're seeing enough quality samples in the reflection, just turn that up to high, and there you go. All right, so this next feature is really cool. It's called Matte Shadow with Alpha. So here's a scene, pretty straightforward. If I solo my Element 3D layer, you can see I have this sort of hole in the ground. Now, if we zoom in, we can see that we have some pretty hard edges around the cutout of this hole. And it looks pretty good because it's kind of jagged and it's kind of far away, so it's not that big of a problem. But in order to make this more realistic, you usually want to have some texture that helps blend between your 3D animation and your live action plate. So you want to kind of gradually fade out from 3D to live action. Now, what we've done is added a new feature called Matte Shadow with an Alpha channel. I'll open up our scene setup, and here I have our hole in the ground. But if I go over here to the material for that top surface, and I'll just reset it. So it's actually just a solid that covers the area other than the hole. But here's what's cool about this particular material is that I'm actually using a texture, a PNG, with an alpha channel. So here's what that does, is I can turn off the matte shadow function. So here's what happens when you load that material. But if you turn on matte shadow, you can also turn on a new option called matte alpha. And what that does is adds the alpha channel from your PNG into your scene. So check this out. You can see it fades out from being opaque to semi-transparent all the way off. So if I hit OK, so now you can see I have a nice gradual fading texture that blends over my live action footage. You can see what that looks like. So this really adds a lot of options. One, it helps for compositing. So if the ground was, say it was, like a dirt road or something like that, well, I could change the color of this top layer texture, and that would help fade it out and blend it with whatever the live action plate was before. Now, here again is another example of the way this feature works. You can see that there is transparency in the cracks, and it's being composited over some live action footage. I've actually used the camera tracker inside of After Effects to do this. Now, here's a couple other ways to use the matte alpha feature. So in this case, we've created a cool burn mark on this victim, and we're 3D tracking it onto the live action plate. And again, you can see that we have some nice gradual transition of the alpha channel, and that really helps to blend with the live action plate. So if I were to take this, the head stitch element, and turn off the matte alpha, it would be a little trickier to composite with a rough edge like that. So you can see here, doesn't quite look as good because it's kind of sharp, but when you use the actual alpha channel, then you get a nice gradual fade out, and you got the creepy monster face. Also in version 2.2, we've added a bunch of advanced visibility options. So let me show you another example here. I've got some cool light streaks. And these light streaks are just created using some deform twisting and stuff like that. And basically, if I go into our scene setup, I created a streak using a simple texture. Looks just like that. And I've set that material to be an additive material. So if I set it to normal, you can basically see it's just a plane that's stretched out. And we set it to add, and I made a few copies. Hold down Alt, rotated a few copies, stretched it out, all that kind of stuff, right? Now, here's the problem. In the previous version, if you tried to do this, it might look something like this. And what's happening here is the ambient occlusion that I've turned on for the scene is affecting the geometry of those planes I'm using to create the light streaks. And that's because screen space ambient occlusion looks at those objects and sees geometry. It doesn't realize that they're actually semi-transparent. So what we've done is we've added a way to ignore these type of materials from the ambient occlusion and some of the other post effects. So here's how it works. You just click on the advanced and you turn on this option called invisible to AO and glow. Now the reason it's invisible to glow as well is because glow is a post effect and so is screen space ambient occlusion. So essentially this makes it invisible to the post effects of ambient occlusion and glow. So if we turn that on and hit OK, now we're actually rendering correctly. But there is one thing that is a little bit different, and that is the ambient occlusion is rendering, but we can see it's composited on top a little bit. So what you want to do is not only do you want to turn on invisible to AO, you also want to turn the AO mode to ignore. And what that will do is make sure that, so here it is before, here it is after. So you can see that we're seeing a little bit of the AO wrap around on top. And we want to make sure that the AO is completely invisible for this material, and that way everything composites correctly. So here we go. We've got the AO rendering correctly on the hard geometry, and then things like the light streaks, which also could be other stuff like fire or smoke, or an animated texture that you load from a comp. Those are going to be perfectly composited without affecting your ambient occlusion and the way it's supposed to look. Now, speaking of getting things to look the way they're supposed to look, I've got another example here that has a really interesting problem. And the problem is you can kind of see it looks like he's wearing some kind of eyeliner. And if I open up our scene setup, I'll explain the issue. So what we have here is a base mesh of Matt's face. So interestingly enough, it's a matte of Matt's face. So whatever that means. But here's what the face looks like. That's fine. Now here's the problem. The face is set to matte shadow. So here it is normally, and we'll turn on matte shadow. And that way it receives the ambient occlusion and shadow. But the problem is it's generating ambient occlusion for itself. So even if I were to take all of these other objects and hide them, it's still creating ambient occlusion around the eyes, which is going to then add additional ambient occlusion where it doesn't need to be added. So the solution is we need the ambient occlusion to only be generated for the objects in relation to the face, but not the face on itself. Does that make sense? I don't know if it makes sense, but let me show you. What you can do now is go into the advanced settings, go to the AO mode, and turn on Receive Ray Traced AO. And what this will do is only allow this material to receive AO, but not generate it for itself. Now, this only works for ray tracing since screen space isn't able to calculate it independently. So we'll turn that on, hit OK, and now you can see we have our ambient occlusion, but we're not adding in that eyeliner and the ear and the mouth shadow. and we're only creating shadows from the objects that are actually sticking in his face. So it's a pretty cool case scenario, and now we've got a pretty cool solution. Now, a couple other quick things that we've added. We've separated the options for visible to reflections and visible to camera. And that way you can actually make it not visible to camera, but visible to reflections. So to illustrate that, let me just create a sphere, and I'm going to set it to be a little bit reflective and set the object to spherical mode. Okay. And let's set this to be red. It's easier to see. Okay. So if I were to take this red material, I could turn off visible to camera, but it'll still be visible to the reflection. See that? Or I can just turn on visible to camera, but not visible to reflection. And likewise, I can have it not visible to the camera, but still cast shadows. So just a few different options there that have already come in handy on a bunch of projects that we've been working on. And as soon as you run into the problem, you're going to be glad that that feature is available to solve it right away. Okay, so here's another cool feature that I know a lot of people are going to dig. And basically, it's the ability to save a group folder as an E3D file. So previously you could save an individual object, but what about an entire scene? Well, now look at how many objects are in this scene. Super unorganized. But I can take this super unorganized scene and I can save it as a model preset. Crazy scene. And that way I can load it up into a different instance of element, and it'll save all your settings, your auxiliary settings, your reflection settings, everything, and be able to load it up into a whole new scene. So I could delete this and just get rid of everything. Then I can go to my favorites here. Then I can come over here to the crazy scene, load it up, boom, it is back in business. So hopefully you guys like that feature. And if you like that feature, you're gonna like the next feature. And the next feature is the ability to export OBJs right out of Element 3D. So you can come over here to the utility. There's a new option, group export. You can export an OBJ for all of the groups. For an individual group, and this is great, let's say you create a cool logo or something that you want to bring into another 3D program, or you want to save it and import it back inside of Element 3D. You could export the entire group as a single object with an E3D file. Just keep in mind that it could take a very long time and you might create OBJs that are way too large. Just be careful because it could create a huge file with all the different geometry that's been repeated. All right, guys, that's Element 3D version 2.2. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Andrew Kramer, and we will see you next time.